Okay, we're right at 7:01. I want to welcome everyone. I think we'll start now. I'm sure we will have more people join in as we continue, but I don't want to have people waiting any longer. Those of you who've been waiting a little bit. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dina Moses. I'm the president of the Charleston Interreligious Council. And I'm just grateful to have you all here tonight to join us this evening for our fourth annual James Sawyers Jr. Interfaith Speaker Series. This speaker series is dedicated to Dr. James Sawyers, a former president of the Charleston Interreligious Council who passed away unexpectedly in 2017. Jim worked hard to progress religious understanding in Charleston, and we all miss him dearly. The subject that we're exploring for our series this year is African American religious diversity and dialogue. It's an 8-part series focused on African American religious life from various religious perspectives. And we encourage you all to please sort of zoom in and join us for all 8 parts of this series that of course starts tonight with Dr. Anthony Pinn and ends in February. So we will have 2 every month. So please follow along. You've registered for all of them just by registering for this. So you will get reminders, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for all those pieces to this sort of puzzle that we're trying to explore of African American religious diversity and dialogue. We are especially grateful to Roper St. Francis Mission Department that has made this series possible, and to our partners at the International African American Museum. The Charleston Interreligious Council, formerly known as the Christian Jewish Council of Greater Charleston, is an organization that has been serving the Charleston community since 1979. We strive to build bridges of understanding and respect of all religious beliefs by creating educational and social events in and around Charleston, and obviously now virtually. So we're continuing to learn and grow as an organization, and we're happy that you're with us in this journey. To learn more about our work and our events, and we have many throughout the year, I encourage you to go to our website at cicouncil.org or join us on Facebook. Again, I thank you for being with us this evening, for supporting our work and exploring this important topic with us tonight and throughout the next couple months. Now I will pass you all off on to Dr. Elijah Siegler, who is our moderator for this evening. Dr. Siegler is the Charleston Interreligious Council's Vice President and Professor and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston. Elijah.
Hey, everybody. Can you all hear me? It's great to see you all. I'm going to introduce our main speaker, but just a couple of Zoom house cleaning tidbits. This talk is currently being recorded. You should have gotten a little message about that. And we will send a link if you, it'll be residing on the Zoom cloud, so people can access it. If you have friends who can't make it, you can send them to the Zoom link. I'll send you a link to that. You'll all be muted. You should all be muted now. I think you are, just to avoid background noise. But during the course of Dr. Pinn's talk, if you have questions, and we encourage any kind of questions, simply type them into the chat box like this. You should be able to chat directly to me. Dr. Pinn won't see the questions, so it won't distract him from his talk, but I'll see them, and I will then invite you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question in your own voice. And I'll kind of rearrange the questions, and I might combine some, but please just at any moment, feel free to use the chat box to type in any questions, because we plan on having a lively discussion. That should be the second half of our program. So we should have a good 20 or 25 minutes for questions. The event itself is going to last, it's scheduled to end right at 8 o'clock. We find that really long Zoom meetings just tire everybody out. If the Q&A is really vivid, we might go an extra 10 or 15 minutes or something. But in general, we'll have you out of here by 8. And of course, you're free to leave at any time. So you will be muted unless you are chosen to ask a question, but we do want your cameras on if possible. Of course, that's up to you, but Dr. Pinn and I both agree that it's nice to see people's faces listening as we talk. So feel free to keep your camera on, even if you're eating dinner or in your pajamas or whatever. We've seen it all, right? That's fine. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just briefly share the screen to show something that you've probably seen before on social media. And this is a description, like what Dina talked about we're really, really excited to have an 8-part series like this. We've had an excellent speaker series, the Charleston Interreligious Council, with Roper St. Francis backing and some organizational help from the Department of Religious Studies at the College of Charleston that I chair currently. I've been doing the speaker series for several years now, and we always get, as we did this year, a nationally known academic to come who's able to speak not just about one religion, but across religious traditions. But this year, first of all, we had to pivot to an all Zoom series, but also we are having a local dimension. So if you look at our talks, we have a lot of people who grew up or have roots in the Charleston area and are also academic experts on their field and or have personal experiences with the great diversity in African American traditions. So 1 week from today, for example, at the same time, and again, you've already registered for this, so feel free to join. We have Professor Damon Fordham, who teaches at the Citadel. He grew up here in Charleston, and he does a lot of research on local African American religion. So that'll be a kind of a local focus. And then after Thanksgiving, on December 8th, we have Dr. Manigault Bryant. She's a professor at Williams College in Massachusetts, but she grew up, I believe, in Goose Creek, and she's studying kind of traditional African and Gullah religions. She also has made a very short documentary film about that. I think it's only 6 minutes long, but she'll screen that at her talk and then talk about it. So you don't want to miss that on December 8th. And then on December 22nd, Dr. Fraser Rahim, he's also a professor at the Citadel. He's a professor of international security studies, but he's an African-American Muslim, and he's also studied the history of African-American Islam, and he's also local. So these are just tremendous speakers. And we're very proud, and we're especially proud that to kick it all off tonight, we've got the, let me stop sharing here. We've got the nationally or really internationally known scholar of religion, Dr. Anthony Pinn. He's not only one of the foremost scholars of African-American religion in the country, he's just one of the foremost scholars of religious studies in general. And his talk today will be kind of a broad overview. He's also going to share some personal experience, so I'm really personally excited. I hope you are too. I'm not going to go over all of his sort of achievements and stuff. You can hold on for 1 sec. I'll just send you in the chat his academic homepage at the Department of Religion at Rice University. That's probably the easiest thing to do. If you go there, maybe I'll share the screen just for a second so you can see. You don't have to do it yourself. So if you see him, here's his smiling mug. You can see that he's written over 11 single author books and many more shorter books, co-edited books, really in the dozens. He's the editor of 5 different book series. He's taught many classes at Rice. He's also an award-winning teacher. And I do want to mention that he, just because I saw this in his email signature as we were having an email correspondence, he's also a professor extraordinarius at the University of South Africa. I just thought I should mention that. We are delighted to have him here as our keynote address. So I don't want to take any more time. So I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Pinn. Dr. Pinn, welcome virtually to Charleston. As we've said many times, when things become safer, he will be coming here in person to give a longer talk. So hopefully you'll all be here. Those of you who are here in the Low Country will be able to meet him in person when that is safe to do so. But that's definitely part of our plans. So Dr. Pinn, welcome to Charleston. Instead of applause, we can do jazz hands, kind of a welcoming applause kind of thing. And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you to everyone who worked so very hard to bring us together this evening. I've learned a lot over the past 7 months conducting business and friendships on Zoom. One of the things I've learned is I don't control the technology in my home. I have limited control over Wi-Fi. So if for some reason my Wi-Fi decides not to cooperate and I drop off, rest assured, I'm struggling and working as hard as I can to get back online. Again, I'm delighted to be with you. And I think it's only reasonable that you have some sense of the social context of anyone you invite to speak with you. You want a sense of what got them to where they are and what shapes their thinking. So I want to share just a bit of my background and then move into some other thoughts. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. My mother's side of the family moved from Halifax, North Carolina, and my father's side of the family moved from Dinwiddie, Virginia. I tell folks that they're part of the Great Migration and they got tired before Canada and stopped in Buffalo. My mother's side of the family was deeply, deeply religious. And so we spent much of our time at my grandfather's church in Lackawanna. Lackawanna is right outside of Buffalo. It was the heart of the steel industry, Bethlehem Steel in that region. Reached a point where my mother decided that being at that small Baptist church was not the best environment for her children. She did not want us to remain within the context of a religious community that restricted the activities and the authority of women for no other reason than gender difference. And so we moved to an independent church, a little closer to my home in Buffalo, really a 5-minute walk from my house. It was a small church, and so the minister of that church was also the Sunday school teacher. One Sunday, we sat in a circle in his office and he asked the typical question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And as you might imagine, folks said doctor, lawyer, teacher, president. I said minister. I'm not quite certain why I said it, but I did. And his response startled me a bit. He said, okay, we start next week. And so as a young child, unable to go to the store by myself or play outside after the street lights went on, that next Sunday, I started exploring and participating in a different dimension of Black church worship. I no longer sat and absorbed, but I produced and I offered. I lined the hymns. I led the prayers. I opened the doors of the church. I was involved in informal ministry, and this increased for me. I preached my trial sermon, and as I was heading off to college, I was already ordained. I could marry, bury, and baptize. Deeply involved in church ministry. And I decided I had to get out of Buffalo. No disrespect to Buffalo, I'm not throwing shade, but I had to leave. It just so happened that the pastor of my church at that time had been reassigned to a church in Brooklyn, a rather large African Methodist Episcopal church, which was now our denomination. And I had gotten into Columbia and just decided this was the leading of the Lord. I was packing up, I was going to New York, and I was going to convert that school for the Lord. And I encountered people who did not believe what I believed. Now, it's important that you know I had spent 3 years at a small Southern Baptist high school that was a feeder program for Bob Jones University, Liberty Baptist. You get the idea. Within that context, critical thinking was not valued. So by the time I got to Columbia, I had to relearn how to think. I had to relearn how to critically engage. And I was encountering people who did not have the same perspective on scripture that I had. From my vantage point, I was sure they were going to hell. And this is what freaked me out. They did not care. I spent time in New York exploring. I didn't have a whole lot of money, but you can walk around New York for free. And so I spent a lot of time walking around, and I was encountering people from a variety of religious traditions. And there was points of agreement and there were points of disagreement. And I was learning and rather uncomfortable with this learning, but nonetheless, I was learning that the religious geography of Black communities was expansive. It was rich, it was thick. For some time, I remained in the church, but it reached a point where church no longer satisfied my needs, and so I left. I became later on what I would identify as a secular humanist. The pulpit was no longer the place for me, but I understood and I appreciated the cultural value and significance of religion. I have never doubted the cultural, historical, and social significance of religion, and I wanted to study it. I didn't have good answers, but I had really good questions. I decided the classroom was for me. And I wanted to wrestle with the diversity of opinion and thought that I was uncovering. I had grown up under the assumption that to say Black religion is to say Black church. If you say Black church, you have covered it all. The historical narrative I had been exposed to was premised upon the dominance of Black church orientation. Now, you might disagree over denominations, but what was clear within popular thought was that the Black church was it. It dominated numerically, no doubt about it. Whether one believes what Black denominations, just take the 7 largest Black denominations, whether one believes what they say about their enrollments or not, it's fair to say we're talking about millions of African Americans who claim on some level a relationship with the Black church. Now, we can argue over the nature of that relationship. Is it just Christmas and Mother's Day, Easter, or is it through the week? We can wrestle with that, but a significant number of African Americans claim the Black church. It has public visibility. From the early abolitionist to the strong and courageous women and men of Black churches who participated in the civil rights movement moving forward, it has public visibility. But it was becoming increasingly clear to me that the Black church did not exist alone. And in fact, if we were careful to listen to conversations that took place within Black churches over the course of centuries, it became even clearer that Black churches understood themselves as being in competition with other forms of religiosity within Black communities. Take Islam, for example. There are scholars who argue that anywhere between 5 and 15% of the enslaved Africans who are brought to what we've called the New World were Muslim. 5 to 15% of the enslaved Africans brought to the New World were Muslim. We have examples of their existence. Think in terms of Omar Said of 1831, a North Carolinian who was a Muslim who wrote a memoir and outlining his sensibilities. Or think of Bilal Muhammad, a Muslim slave in Georgia. We have examples of enslaved Africans who claimed Islam. Now, they were in a context that did not allow them to maintain all of the nuance, all of the ritual practices and structures. The brutality of enslavement did not allow for that, but there are narratives by Blacks and whites indicating the presence of Muslims. So there are reports from overseers who talk in terms of the way some enslaved Africans prayed too often, like 5 times a day. And they spoke in this odd language and gave their children odd names and refused to eat pork. We have examples of Islam being present, a competing faith claim as Black churches are developing. In addition, we know that African spiritual sensibilities survived the Middle Passage. Now, these traditions may not have remained intact, but they survived the Middle Passage. So we know of conjure, we know of hoodoo, we know of the development of voodoo. African-American folklore and folk wisdom speaks to the existence of these traditions. Think in terms of the blues. Got my mojo working. Like the blues outline religious commitments that extend beyond the Black church, right? The blues often signify, make light of the Black church by celebrating, by embracing dimensions of life that are uncomfortable for the Black church. So for example, within the blues, there's a celebration of sexuality. There's a celebration of our occupation of time and space, the mundane dimensions of life. But the blues also point to conjure, hoodoo, folk wisdom. There's a story told. It's part of a collection developed by a Methodist minister, but these are also stories that Albert Roboteau outlines in that wonderful book from the 1970s, Slave Religion. There's a dude who's interested in this young woman, just cannot get her out of his mind. So he goes to the root doctor. That should ring a bell. Root doctor, probably not church. And he asked, well, what do I do to get this young woman's attention? You know, she just won't give me the time of day. What do I do? The root doctor told him, get some of her hair and bring it back to me. Now, my grandmother, who was a sure enough Christian, taught us, while I still had hair, my grandmother taught us, you be careful with your hair clippings. You don't let just anybody get a hold of your hair clippings. Why? Because there was a type of power, something about you could be controlled through that device. Same thing with nail clippings. She said, you be careful with your nail clippings. You hold on to them because there's a certain type of power that is harnessed in that. My grandmother didn't get that from the AME Book of Discipline. So this man is told by this root doctor, get some of her hair. So he goes and he gets this young woman and he grabs her and he's trying to pull some of this hair to try to get it to the root doctor so that she would fall in love with him. Now, as you might imagine, that didn't go particularly well, but what we ought to take away from that is the existence of traditions that cannot be explained by simply pointing to the Black church. There's another story, and this is a story about a dude who's really interested in changing his fortune. Things are not going particularly well for him. And so what he's told to do is to appeal to St. Barbara. And he's told that St. Barbara loves cigar smoke and rum, and that he should light a cigar, expose the room to the smoke, take some rum, spray it out, and say three times, St. Barbara, open the door. St. Barbara, open the door. St. Barbara, open the door, and promise in exchange, I will give you this piece of money if you do X, Y, and Z for me. This is a type of bargaining that you cannot associate easily with the Black church. Now, his effort failed. And his effort failed because the money he promised St. Barbara, he did not deliver. And as a consequence, half his house was burned down. Now, our takeaway from that is that there is a sense of religiosity that pulls from signs and symbols and personalities and persons that are familiar to us, St. Barbara, but that work them in a way that is inconsistent with the Christian church. Black Catholics would be aware of St. Barbara, but not as one who loves rum and cigar smoke. Who's that? That's Chango, the Yoruba deity associated with love and warfare. Chango loves cigar smoke, loves rum. Now, what was the commonality between St. Barbara and Chango? St. Barbara, patron saint of soldiers, of warriors. Chango, a premier warrior. St. Barbara often depicted wearing red. Red is Shango's color. All of this to suggest there are so many traditions alive within Black communities that cannot be captured by simply turning to the Black church. So I wanted to recognize all of this, but it raised a question for me. How do we, inside and outside of the academy, talk about religion in a way that doesn't damage this diversity? How do we talk about Black religion in a way that doesn't damage, doesn't negate this diversity, doesn't negate the fact that there are these overlapping traditions that are competing? Now, with most of these traditions, they're theistic in nature. But here was the problem. I was discovering that for as long as there had been people of African descent in North America, there had been Black humanists and atheists. This one's a little more difficult to include in this category of expansive Black religion. But these Black humanists and atheists were real. So you get someone like Bishop Alexander Payne, major figure in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who argued that slavery had to come to an end. One reason being it was turning Black people away from religion. It was turning them away from God. And he gives an example. He's going about his business, and as was his practice, when he ran across folks, he asked them about their religious inclinations. He runs into this young brother and asked him, well, do you go to church? And this enslaved African says, no, I don't believe in that stuff. I can't go to church. I don't believe in that. And he asked why. He said, well, if white people who are doing this to us claim that God, I can't have anything to do with it. Bishop Alexander Payne argues that this is evidence of a shift in sensibilities away from theism, away from belief in God, that is being stimulated and reinforced by the nastiness of enslavement. You can move along the timeline. Take someone like Frederick Douglass, who in personal letters wrestles with how to present publicly the cause for Black people and not let it slip that he's not so convinced about the Black church. He says this in rather subtle ways. You'll recall that Frederick Douglass, and I'm paraphrasing, says that he didn't really understand the importance and power of prayer until he prayed with his legs. What does that mean? Until he did something. The list goes on and on of African Americans who claim no particular religious affiliation, in fact, understand themselves as humanists and atheists. Think in terms of the great civil rights strategist Bayard Rustin or A. Philip Randolph, not churchmen. So I had this, in addition to this variety of theistic orientations, I had this non-theistic, often hostile towards theism orientation within Black communities. How do you develop a way to talk about these traditions that is respectful, that recognizes the differences, doesn't try to collapse them, but also recognizes the similarities? In 2003, I offered a possibility. And I argued that, look, the doctrines, creeds, rituals, structures, the clothing, all of that is a historical manifestation of something much deeper. At the end of the day, if we drill deep, what we come to recognize is that Black religion at its core is a quest for complex subjectivity. That is to say that Black religion at its core is the effort of traumatized people dealing with anti-Black racism in its variety of forms to wrestle with the fundamental questions of human existence. Who are we? When are we? Why are we? And that the historical manifestation of this wrestling is presented in Black church, it's presented in Black Islam, it's presented in hoodoo and voodoo and Santeria and conjure. But all of these traditions at their base are concerned with that fundamental issue, the effort to make life meaningful in a context that is absurd and death dealing. That gave me a way of theorizing Black religion without having to exclude any tradition. I don't have to wipe out their difference to understand them as being about the business of meaning making. Now, within that context, I argued that there are at least two things that all of these traditions, despite their theological and philosophical knockdown, drag out disagreements, at least two things that they hold in common. One, they are concerned with how Black bodies occupy time and space. They are about the business of speaking about, celebrating, ritualizing, articulating Black bodies rightfully occupying time and space. They work based upon a profound understanding of embodiment. They work based upon a deep appreciation for and concern with the material circumstances of life in an effort to address, revise, transform those circumstances, to rethink what it means to occupy a Black body, and to do it in a way that moves beyond negation and celebrates the beauty, the importance, the substance, the weight of Black embodiment. Now, tied to that, my argument is all of these traditions are concerned with a core question, and it's a hard question. Theologians and philosophers often call it the issue of theodicy. Simply put, it raises this question: what can you say about God in light of human suffering in the world? What can you say about God in light of misery in the world? All of these traditions wrestle with this. Let me give you an example. The Nation of Islam. Nation of Islam develops in 1930. 1930 is a rough year in the United States. Think Depression. 1930 in Detroit, there's this rather soft-spoken African-American who is going through Black communities, just telling folks things they've not heard before, right? Think about the Black communities being constantly bombarded with anti-Black messages. And this man is going through selling fine scarves and other items. These folks didn't need these things. It's the Depression. But what they found so very exciting was this conversation. He told them they were the original people, that they weren't a problem, they were a solution, that they were created in the image of God, they were controllers of the universe, they were of greatness. Now imagine that, how that might hit someone's ear in 1930 Detroit, living in a context, again, that is deeply anti-Black, living in a country that has belittled and attempted to objectify Blacks. They are being told, you are important. This universe revolves around you. The numbers are growing. The numbers are growing. Folks are excited about this. And as they gain size, they name themselves the Nation of Islam. Master Farad Muhammad, this gentleman who had gone about, selects someone who is going to be his right-hand man. We've come to know him as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but he had moved from the South as Elijah Poole. And here's where we get to this question. What can you say about God in light of human suffering in the world? The Nation of Islam makes this argument. People of African descent were created by Allah. They exist in the image of Allah, but white people were made by the mad scientist, Mr. Yaqub. They were made for mischief and for damage. Now, why are Black people who are God's chosen, they are the original people, why are they catching hell? Well, the Nation of Islam argued because they lost sight of their original religion. They had embraced Christianity, etc. They lost sight of their original religion. But all of this could be resolved if they simply developed a proper knowledge of self and an allegiance to the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Christians wrestle with this question as well. Black Christians wrestle with this question and typically resolve it in this way. Why do we suffer? God is loving, kind, just, and compassionate. Why do we suffer? Well, there are some possibilities. One, because we are guilty of misconduct, and this is righteous punishment. God is teaching us a lesson. Two, God is trying to equip us with something. No cross, no crown. Third, like Job, we just don't know, but God is still good. Right? Wrestling with this fundamental question, what sense can you make out of this? How do you understand and come to grips with being Black in an anti-Black world and experiencing such misery when God is loving, kind, just, and compassionate? They're wrestling with this. African-based traditions take another perspective. This misery we encounter is a temporary imbalance that can be corrected. It might require the need for a sacrifice to a particular deity. We got to get this right, create balance, and everything will be good. Again, I'm simply suggesting that one, religion, Black religion at its core, is a matter of meaning making. And Christian churches, Islam, Black Buddhists, folks who practice Ifa, all of these traditions become historical manifestations of that deeper yearning to make life meaningful. Their rituals, their deeds, their creeds are all about wrestling with those fundamental questions. Who are we? When are we? Why are we? Let me just offer a couple of takeaways and then we'll chat. That work? Okay. First takeaway. We need to rethink religious difference. And rather than assuming it is a problem to solve, we need to understand it as an opportunity. When we understand it as a problem to solve, we move quickly to dismissing the differences. And we say things like, well, these religions are really all the same thing. Respect the differences, right? Think about the difference as an opportunity. That with these various religious traditions, we have an opportunity to develop a complex and thick and rich way of understanding how Black people have tried to make life meaningful in a death-dealing world. We gain a sense of complexity within the Black community, that it is not monolithic. Difference is an opportunity. It is not a problem to solve. Secondly, it encourages us to ask a different set of questions. When we encounter folks who don't believe quite what we believe, it seems to me the natural tendency is to try to figure out what's wrong with their tradition. Over the course of my 20 plus years as an instructor, I've had a whole lot of students come into my classroom who are trying to get tools to use, right? And these are not tools to better understand the complexity of religious life. It's to get enough information about a tradition to be able to take it out. Let me learn enough about this tradition to figure out its flaws and figure out why mine is better. It seems to me the better approach is to recognize that folks embrace a tradition because on some level it is meeting their needs. Right? On some level, it is answering questions that are compelling to them. And so it affords us an opportunity to wrestle with overlap within the context of this geography of Black life, of Black communities. What are the underlying questions that are being asked over and over again? What are the types of yearning and need that are being expressed creatively over and over again within these traditions? what are they trying to understand and explore? Finally, it seems to me it gives us an opportunity to understand and better appreciate the messy nature of religious life within the United States. The religious geography of the United States is composed of overlapping and competing faith claims, all meant to help folks come to grips with what it means to be in time and space, how we go about occupying this time and space in ways that are meaningful and lasting. With that, I'll stop and let's chat.
Thank you, Dr. Pinn. Jazz hands for applause. You're still on mute, or this, or this. And we've got some, we've got a few questions coming in, but keep them coming. You can have questions, you can have personal questions, academic questions, historical questions, theological questions. Dr. Pinn, I'm guessing you're game for everything. Let's start with someone who actually is also a professor of African American religion here at the College of Charleston, and that is Dr. Matthew Kressler. Let's see. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question, and well, then I'll unmute people in turn. So Matthew, take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pinn. This was incredible. It was such a joy to be taught by you in real time, having been taught by your books so many times before. So my question, it's either two questions or a two-part question, but I'm just going to ask ask them together. You know, one of the things that was really striking to me about your biography as it dovetailed into your study was how it in some ways mirrored James Baldwin's journey as a child of, you know, our parents who migrated, and someone who was a preacher at an early age, kind of leaving the church, but not just leaving, but becoming one of, I think, the most insightful thinkers about African American religious life. And it struck me that we could say the same thing about Frederick Douglass, and you know, of course, similarly about your own work. And so, you know, I was wondering whether you know, in terms of, I love your the way you weave Black humanism and atheism into this kind of constellation of Black religious life. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about perhaps, you know, do you see kind of Black atheists and humanists like Douglass, like Baldwin, as having a unique insight into the tradition because of their because they've kind of left it behind? And the kind of question that may be the same part of the same thing or something different is, I know, you know, a lot of your scholarship on hip hop as well, and I think of hip hop, of course, having its own kind of infusion of religious traditions, both Muslim and Christian, but also in some senses sometimes serving as a kind of outside kind of voice, another outside humanistic voice that kind of can sometimes talk back to the Black church or talk back to Black religion. And so I wonder if perhaps hip hop serves in a similar, in some instances anyway, in a similar kind of prophetic role that kind of Baldwin and Douglass and perhaps your work does as well. So just grateful for you and your scholarship, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
You're very kind, very generous. So we don't have time for me to call the role, but there are a lot of ancestors who have helped me clarify my thinking. I would have to mention Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, right? There are these folks who've provided, W.E.B. Du Bois, who provided a way for me to think. In terms of Baldwin, that's interesting, right? Because lots of folks get stuck on go tell it on the mountain, and they don't think of Baldwin beyond that. But Baldwin, in reflecting on a meeting he was going to have with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, is a bit nervous because he's like, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is going to ask me about religion and what and in that, Baldwin reflects on his transformed sensibilities and argues that writing is his religion. There's something about that I find meaningful, and I tend to filter some of this through another of my favorite thinkers, Richard Wright, who argues that we have an obligation not only to reflect on experience, but to experience the experience of our community. Right, so that within one lifetime, he argues, within one lifetime, we ought to absorb this experience in such a way that it feels as if we have lived the long century. So I think with someone like Baldwin, what you get is reflection, thoughtful, beautiful reflection that involves having experienced the experience. And so there's a distinction to be made, I think, on some level between a Baldwin who experiences the experience and reflects through that with grace and thoughtfulness, and a W.E.B. Du Bois for whom religion was never really big. Right? He grows up in small town Massachusetts. They're not particularly religious, and that never changes for him. He's really insightful in terms of the Black church, but much of his thinking is about the mechanics of the Black church, as opposed to the effective dimensions of the Black church or the thought experiment that is the Black church. So I think there's something there. And I would want to believe, I would hope that it's the case that my work on these traditions is generous to some extent because I've experienced the experience. In terms of hip hop, man, I don't know if we have enough time to really go through all of this. You know, hip hop is my thing. But with hip hop, it seems to me you get a kind of deep and powerful reflection on the religious geography of Black communities. So you have artists who are sure enough Christian. You have those who use this as an opportunity to speak on behalf of the Nation of Islam, but even more than that, the 5% nation. Right, a variety of traditions represented. You have the artists who critique religious traditions. You've got artists who transform the religious traditions. Think of a Tupac and Black Jesus, the patron saint of thugs. He's using this language, this icon remains, but he makes Black Jesus something that would be highly unrecognizable within the traditional Black church. His Black Jesus is not the Black Jesus at Sunrise Baptist Church. But then you get something that's really interesting. You get the development of an alternate religious orientation. Watch the Throne, Jay-Z and Kanye West. That song, that track, Watch the Throne, you get Kanye saying, we formed a new religion. No sin as long as there's permission. Right, a recasting of religion, still arguing that Black folks need a way to make life meaningful, a way to wrestle with the fundamental questions of life, but signifying ways in which we've typically done that and positing it's time for something new. Or think in terms of Jay-Z on that track, Crown. You're in the presence of a king, scratch that, you're in the presence of a God, right? And he goes on to chronicle his attributes as a God. And it's interesting to read what he says about his own divinity over against what God at the end of the book of Job says about God's divinity, right? I mean, it's really interesting. So you have all these taking place, and then you have someone like KRS-One who argues hip hop is a religion and rappers are godlike. Why? Because they create worlds with words. Let there be. Hope that helps some.
Great answer. So our next question comes from Kira Gaines. Kira, I'm going to unmute you now. So you just read the question that you already asked me, or rephrase it if you like, but it's a good one.
All righty, thank you. So first of all, well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the wonderful talk, Dr. Pinn. I want to give a bit of background. I'm taking an African American Studies course with Dr. Mingo, Dr. Henry Mingo. And so this was you really just summed up my whole semester thus far, which was wonderful. So I'm going to ask this question. I realize we have about 9 minutes left, so, bear with me. But my question is, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more or just talk a bit about the influences of colonization and white patriarchy / supremacy on the nature of Black religion as it manifested in the United States. So this is particularly in the church and Christianity, and how it manifests particularly as anti-feminist and heterosexist. And then as a follow-up, could you talk a bit about how Black religion at its core is the antithesis of such influences?
Are you going hard, aren't you? I'm not mad at you. Okay, let me do my best. So it seems to me, yes, that the Black church comes about within a context of white supremacy and white privilege. And there are various ways in which Black church has responded to that. One is the politics of respectability. If we can be in a way that white folks are comfortable with, right? If we can present ourselves in a way that makes sense to them, they will have to embrace us. I would tie into that certain theological formulations and imagery. Think the white Jesus in Black churches, right? It still works based upon the underlying assumption of white superiority in all things: aesthetics, thought, embodiment, and what is best about the interaction between God and the human gets projected that way: blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. And so on some level, you have within Black churches a not so subtle theological and ritual argument that whiteness is closer to divinity. It comes across in other ways that from my vantage point are no less harmful, but not as visual. Now think of some of the imagery within our music: "Wash Me White as Snow." Like this negative color symbolism that is a key element of white supremacy and white privilege gets played out uncritically within Black churches. Now, there are those who have argued against that. Think in terms of figures like Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, the first Black woman ordained an Episcopal priest, who's not having it, right? Who wants to rethink these categories, not only in terms of rejecting anti-Black racist imagery and language, but also holding Black churches and white churches accountable for their sexism. Then there's the thinker James Cone, the great theologian, who argues that Blackness is godly, that God is in fact Black. And by that, he's not really concerned with a physical look. He's saying that God's self-understanding and God's movement in the world is so intimately connected to those who suffer most, for him, Black people, that God is indistinguishable. Now, I think you're right that there are ways in which Black churches, for example, have embraced white privilege, white supremacy, ways they have fought it in terms of anti-Black racism, but they have bought into the patriarchal structure of the country. And we have clear signs of that. Just think in terms of women in ordained ministry and how long it took the first Black denomination, the AME Church, how long it took them not just to ordain Black women, but to elevate a Black woman to the highest office in the church, bishop. We're talking about a church that develops in the 1800s, but it's the 20th century before Vashti McKenzie is made bishop. Right, so it has rejected certain elements of injustice and embraced other social codes and social patterns of disregard. Don't even get me started on the homophobia within Black churches, right? So it has done this thing where it has argued against certain elements of disregard while embracing other elements. And what it reinforces for us, I think, is a recognition that Black churches, churches in general, religion in general, is not free from the web of oppression. Oppression is web-like in nature, and religious organizations are tangled in it.
Thank you. Great question. Great answer. We've got more questions. I hope to get maybe 2 or 3 more questions. I want to unmute Frank Harris to ask your question now.
Dr. Pinn, thank you so much for this opportunity, for this talk. My question is in relation to COVID, and I'm wondering what challenges, dangers, or opportunities do you see for the Black church in relation to COVID and the disadvantages of not being able to gather physically if this continues long term? And I'm thinking about the historical context for a community that gained such strength and value and overcame obstacles in wanting to and being able to gather physically.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things there. It seems to me that for some time now, Black churches have understood the need to embrace technology if they are going to survive. Think in terms of mega churches and the significant use of technology. Like significant use of technology that allows pastoring, that allows worship from a distance. So it seems to me that this becomes another call for Black churches to be creative and imaginative with respect to how they understand community, how they understand the gathering of the like-minded, right? Creativity in terms of how worship is configured and understood. It also seems to me that it poses a challenge for churches that understand themselves as being outward facing. How do you make use of your resource to aid those who suffer most? Right? How do churches make use of their resource? Thought in really broad and expansive ways. How do churches make use of their resources to help those who are suffering most? Think in terms of how Black and brown folks disproportionately suffer the consequences of COVID. This becomes an opportunity for churches that again say they are about the business of liberation and freedom to reassess how they use resource. So be creative in terms of use of technology, be creative and exercise a kind of fluid sensibility with respect to what it means to gather, and reassess resource use.
Great. We have a couple more questions. Of course, if you have another Zoom meeting or something, feel free to jump off, but stay if you can. I think a good related question that also puts a kind of local spin on this is from Cindy Wofford. So Cindy, do you want to ask your question to Dr. Pinn?
Sure. Charlestonians and many of us in the nation will forever remember Obama singing Amazing Grace at Mother Emanuel. The power in that moment was very palpable and could today once again serve as a springboard as we as a society strive to be who we hope to be. How could or does that image of who we are as a nation while grieving together through faith at that time possibly transform us today during this time of such division in our country?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And unfortunately, I don't have a very hopeful response.
Don't say that.
I think it was a powerful moment, right? A moment in which the most powerful person in the United States demonstrated vulnerability, right? Mourned. Here's the challenge for me. While that is powerful on the affective level, I'm not quite convinced any of that forced the nation to rethink the underlying problem: white supremacy and anti-Black racism, right? In part because it cast Blacks in a way that is comfortable for the nation. The nation has no problem thinking about Black people as religious, right? No problem thinking about Black people as religious. Actually likes to think about Black people as religious. They, of course, tie that to turning the other cheek, but they love to see Black people as religious. It feeds into a comfortable perception of Black people, but that did little to force a reckoning with the ways in which Black people are understood as not rightly occupying time and space. And it seems to me, related to that, it gave us a really graphic marker. You'll think about church burnings, 1980s, 1990s, moving forward, yeah? And one of the things that was shocking about church burnings is because we tended to think of religious space as off limits. You don't mess with those, right? And typically, now there are clear examples of that not being the case that have stuck with us. The killing of those 4 little girls have stayed with us. But what it says to me is the way in which anti-Black racism, an effort to maintain white supremacy, respects no boundaries. And I don't know that that moment with President Obama in the church did anything to force a reckoning with that problem. We can't make change until we reckon with that. And it seems to me, just a couple of things quickly on that. One, it seems to me as a nation, we have to change our understanding and our posture, that we have to come to appreciate the pedagogical value, the transformative value of discomfort. We cannot change race relations in the United States. We cannot end anti-Black racism. We cannot end homophobia. We cannot end sexism, classism, etc., and assume that people remain comfortable. We have to become comfortable with discomfort. It also seems to me that if we are going to address anti-Black racism, for example, it requires serious attention to reparations. Now, we can frame that in terms of biblical lessons. We can frame that in terms of theological pronouncements if we like, but at the end of the day, we will not wipe out anti-Black racism if we don't take seriously reparations, because then we're trying to do it based upon what Bonhoeffer might call cheap grace. We want to do it with a very small price tag. We want to do it and not lose much.
Great. We're going to have time for one last question, so I'm going to unmute Lydia Chadwick. And for those of you we didn't get a chance to ask your questions, I apologize, but they're great questions. So we'll have one last talk, and then I'll just say a sentence or two about next week, and we'll close down the meeting. So Lydia, take it away, please.
Hey, can you guys hear me? Okay, hi. I just had a quick question. I actually grew up a lot like you in the church, Catholic Church, and upon leaving it, noticed a lot. Like, I was shocked that people weren't believing what I was believing. So that really spoke to me in that way. But I was just wondering, I grew up with I went to Catholic school and I didn't have any Black people or any person of color in my classrooms growing up, let alone in my social life at all. But, the social narrative of 2020, I was just wondering, what's the best way to be like an ally and push for change? Especially like Black Lives Matter. And I also wanted to know what's the best way to support diversity in religion.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things on that. One, I think I tend to think about it this way, that those who benefit most from the system as it is bear the greater burden in transforming the system. So one, it seems to me that it requires a recognition of privilege. So as a Black male, to address sexism requires me recognizing my privilege, being uncomfortable with it, naming it. In terms of allies and being in solidarity, it seems to me what we have to do is locate a community of concern and ask that community of concern for our marching orders. Right? That is to say, if Black Lives Matter is the thing, then it requires communicating with a local organization and asking, what do you need me to do? Find a community of concern, ask what can be done, follow the marching orders given. And always, always, we have to recognize and challenge our privilege.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. I want to let's everyone to thank again, however you choose. Thank one more time this excellent speaker who's really given like us a proper keynote address, hit on so many important themes, really making the Zoom medium, worthwhile. So next week we invite you back for Professor Fordham, who will be talking about the diversity of African American experience, but from a local perspective, as a local historian of Charleston. So please join us here. It'll be great to kind of get the community back together, as it were, even if it's only virtual. Invite your friends to register. One registration for all the remaining meetings. Dr. Pinn, thank you so much for your time. Good night, everyone.
My pleasure.